As a continuation of the process started in my first movie on how to create an HDR panorama utilizing 6 individual RAW files in Lightroom, utilizing a series of virtual copies along with those originals, I continue here with the final building of that panorama and then post-production in Lightroom and Photoshop. Now I'm going to take the 6 HDR images I built from the 6 single-frame shots I made while out in Monument Valley, faux HDRs, as I had not made the normally prerequisite 1 overexposure, 1 underexposure, and a normal or best overall exposure for each in order to build a true HDR image with. And now turn them all into a beautifully executed, seamless panorama right here inside Lightroom. I will once again be using the photo merge feature available with the release of version 6 and Lightroom CC 2015. These are the 6 HDRs I generated in the last movie, all lined up and ready to go. And as I mentioned at the end of the last movie, all my post-production tweaks have been put off until after the panorama has been rendered. I select the first of my images here in the library's grid view. Then holding down the Shift key, click on the last in this series I will direct Lightroom to use in the photo merge process. I right-click or Control-click on a Mac over one of the selected images to pop open an options dialog. Navigating to photo merge, then choosing panorama as the process I want to start. I always make sure that the auto crop option is selected, and of course I allow for Lightroom to auto select projection from among the options that are available here. As you can see, as is most often the case with nearly all my panoramas built, Photo Merge opts for the spherical layout method for joining my images. Just to quickly show you how Photo Merge might build the final panorama had I selected the layout parameters myself, here is the cylindrical layout with auto crop turned off so you can see the technology's rendering results. And then from selecting the perspective option with images I provided in this circumstance. Spherical is much the same as the cylindrical projection example, but there is a substantial difference between those two and the perspective option. It seems shorter and longer because the perspective layout tends to bow tie its projection of the image set more dramatically with a wide-angle lens, even with a generous overlap frame to frame, but even noticeably when using a lens zoomed out to the equivalent of an 80mm lens using a full-frame DSLR or an older 35mm film camera, as you can see here with the options set to perspective. Now watch what happens when the auto crop directive is reestablished here. Then I cycle through both cylindrical and spherical projections. This is why I leave it up to Adobe's Photo Merge technology to render the panorama and crop its edges automatically. As with both the spot removal tool in Lightroom and the spot healing brush tool in Photoshop, all three are almost magical in their ability to simply get it right more often than not, as you will see in a minute when I do some body snatching within Lightroom as part of the finished panorama's post-production tweaks. When the rendered panorama lands inside the library's grid, I first rate the file with 3 stars. Again, just a file organizing decision I made a while back to help me discern between the umpteen images I keep building in my ever-expanding catalog. And then, pressing the D key, I move the file into the Develop module for much of my post-production work. The first thing I do is an overall sharpening treatment to the merged panorama. Rather than to tweak my images in advance of the Panorama-build, I wait till I have a single image, the intended panorama, to work on so I can affect it all at once. I will first zoom in on the image 1:1 or at its full pixel resolution size so that I can focus on the details, edges, sensor noise, or granulation when you're using an older DSLR like I am with this project file. I tend to pull the amount slider well into its scale till the amount of sharpening I see on the screen moves into the obnoxious range. Then, to rid myself of most of the granularity that tends to build within my files the more I push the amount slider, I pull back on the detail slider's default value of 25, often right back down to 0, perhaps a click or two from that. All the while, I'm looking for both luminance and color noise, wanting only to affect these subtly rather than to hit the image with a sledgehammer of sorts. Sometimes uber luminance smoothing can provide an interesting, almost painterly effect, but that's not what I'm after in this case. Next, I want to get rid of all the distractions in this image. The errant sensor spots I am unable to rid myself of as quickly and easily as more modern DSLRs are capable of doing in camera. In my older camera, it's a real physical chore, unless I take care of things in Lightroom with the spot removal tool. As mentioned earlier, the algorithms built into this technology, generally as in Photoshop's spot healing brush, is normally pretty astounding. You can count on the spot removal tool to make quick work of those sensor spots in the sky, normally the most easily found area to find these imperfections. But what I find most remarkable about this tool is its ability to work so well in more complex areas, like the sandstone cliffs with all that detail. I am rarely disappointed, though sometimes I have to help the software out just a bit. Here are some great examples of what can be done. First, I'll make some repairs to the sandstone cliff. Here's some sensor schmutz to get rid of. I'll just zoom in a bit so we can see this process a bit more clearly. That's not a bad patch, but I'm going to see if I can direct Lightroom to sample from an area not so close by, so that once the spot removal is complete, the patch doesn't at all look like it's repetitive or obviously a clone from just above or just to the side, as Lightroom will often do. Watch as I grab the same point, and with my mouse still depressed, I then pull that sampling circle above and to the left, start sampling from the portion of the cliff face that has long, painterly strokes from centuries of desert varnish staining on the rock surface. I think that's much better. Now, how about something more difficult? Let's get rid of several tourists. Dad's the first as I try to reestablish a sense of solitude out in this vast, mystical landscape. I paint out all the figure with the spot healing brush and then let Lightroom have a go at patching in the landscape. Now, even though if you look closely there's an obvious repetition of alluvial fan debris in the patch, notice how well Lightroom has matched the edge, its elevation, color, and tone of the rock table everyone is standing on. When we zoom back to the one-to-one view of this image, it is more difficult to notice any sort of repetitive pattern. And when I zoom out all the way in order to see the entire landscape at once, as we will in a moment after getting rid of the other two figures here, viewing this panorama as we would on a large screen or in a large print, these tourist patches will become certifiably invisible. Let's move on to Junior. Note that by depressing the mouse, by employing a left click, the hand transforms into a sort of clenched fist. This is what happens when I intend to drag the sample area Lightroom has created to another place I want to pull from. However, by left-clicking on that hand as the hand is transformed into a grasping fist, Lightroom makes the outline of the area initially painted on with the spot healing brush simply vanish, allowing us to view the patch in real time as it will when we move on to the next spot healing challenge. By pressing Return on a Mac or Enter on a PC, or by simply pressing the keyboard shortcut for the spot healing brush, the letter Q, to disengage the tool. That's another patching success. Now let's get rid of Mom. Beauty. But there's still a length of toilet paper caught in the desert brush here. Toilet paper, be gone. Even zoomed in, it is difficult to notice where the patches have been made, especially if you weren't aware any were used to get rid of distractions in the completed panorama. And like I said just a minute ago, when the landscape is fit to screen, as well if it were printed to 40 inches or 102 centimeters wide, no one would see the fixes made easily here in Lightroom. Next, I want to make this landscape look more like it was shot immediately after sunset with a lot less cloud cover, so I will go straight away to add an overall contrast adjustment. Then, even though a bit of clarity would also be helpful, a global clarity adjustment would not work well at all. If you think about how your eyes work when you're surveying a vast panoramic landscape as we are here in this photograph, your mind's eye focuses in on a portion of the whole, not the entirety of the landscape. Generally, the landscape becomes less sharp the further away it is within the overall scene. So instead of using the global clarity adjustment here in the basic panel, I will instead tap the graduated filter tool up above and create my own more controlled focus by using the clarity adjustment only, drawing the viewer's eye to where it would most likely focus if we were standing on a ridge facing John Ford's Point, this long rock table in the foreground where he set up many a scene from back in the years of shooting classic Western films here in Monument Valley between the late 1930s and the mid-1950s. Note that by floating my mouse cursor over the graduated filter's control widget, I am able to momentarily assess how the filter is affecting my image. This is because I have the tool overlay set to auto show and its adjustment mask overlay set to the color white, as you can see when I navigate down from the Tools menu here in the Develop module. Now, in that I want to affect the clarity adjustment to simulate the effect our mind would have in directing our focus inside the panorama to the rock shelf, cliffs, and buttes directly behind that ridgeline, you can see I am pulling up from the right corner of the image here, and that sharpening effect, created by my clarity settings, gradually dissipates by the time my graduated filter reaches sky in that part of the composition. When I zoom back out now, you can see the desert and all those further buttes maintain that added contrast from my initial global settings for this composition. Yet even though they were sharpened at the beginning of my post-processing here in Lightroom, appear to be in softer focus, just as our eyes and mind would process a wide view like this in the real world. Really briefly, I'm going to review some additional organizational tasks before doing just a bit more targeted image editing within Photoshop, where I can oftentimes better control precisely what I want to do while finessing an image before calling it done. I went into greater detail with this in the first movie, so real quick now, I go to the Snapshots panel and get rid of the Lightroom generated import entry for this panorama. Then I navigate down to the bottom of the history record, and over the entry Multiple Settings, I right-click or control-click on a Mac to pop open a couple of options, selecting Create Snapshot. When a window opens, I type in Lightroom's PhotoMerge Initial Settings, as this is where PhotoMerge trimmed the ragged edges initially created by it building a spherical rendering of my 6 images into one, and then cropped the panorama before creating a new physical file as a DNG, Adobe's Open Standard RAW file. Then I save one more snapshot representing the post-production work I have just completed. To remind myself on into the future, this snapshot represents my work to first sharpen the pano, then conduct my sensor schmutz and tourist erasing spot removal, contrast, clarity, and the graduated filter effect I completed at the tail end of my work here in Lightroom. Now let's compare what I've been able to accomplish here to build a 6-frame HDR panorama without ever having to leave Lightroom, saving tons of time and creating a realistic rendering in high dynamic range. Then, with the original panorama I built within Photoshop a couple of years ago, see a noticeable difference as there is obviously greater tonal range now. Vastly more detail in the sky without the obnoxious tone mapping effect of images squeezed through other HDR applications, and a smoother range of tones within the mid-range and even throughout the shadow areas, allowing for me or potentially anyone else editing this image resolved to now further enhance with improvised lighting effects devised inside Photoshop, utilizing separate adjustment layers with attendant masks. This is an example of how I decided to add just a bit of color and tone enhancements in Photoshop, an interpretation of how weather patterns like those high clouds reflect sunset light out along the Colorado Plateau. Not nearly so dramatic as how I've witnessed the landscape transformed right after a summer storm has rolled through the Red Rock Sandstone Canyons when I was working out in the field, and still, while a dramatic interpretation of what I had to start with, a realistic HDR that fools the mind's eye and doesn't fall into the easy trap of standard HDR software in the hands of artistes who insist upon cooking their images with heavy-handed effects to achieve some misguided understanding of the label surrealism. But like they say, different strokes for different folks, I guess. I will never go down this path. And once again, from 6 original underexposed single-frame files, and then my faux HDR panorama generated entirely within Lightroom to sweeten further later on in Photoshop, as you see here.